Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim. Today, I want to talk about the the creation of the origin of the Fallout setting. If you remember what I said in my video about design documents, it all starts with setting. And I want to talk about that. What prompted me to think about this was somebody I know who's in the industry, I've never worked with them, said, I'd be interested to know more about how Fallout setting got created. And I thought I had mentioned it, but looking back, I've dropped little bits and pieces here and there in other videos. So I'm going to try to make you a timeline of what happened. To create this timeline, I had to do a lot of research. I had both digital and actual packed away notes. And while going through those boxes, that's when I found this shirt, which I don't think I've worn in 5 years. So minimum, maybe longer. That's why it's all wrinkly. Sorry. But it also made me realize that I don't always remember things, and neither do other people I talk to, because I found dated written notes that mention some things I'm like, I don't remember that. So it's sort of like uh, the naming of Fallout, where when I actually went back and looked at the names we came up on the brainstorm meeting, where Brian Fargo was not there, and then I went to talk to Brian about naming days later, or maybe even a week later, and he thought of Fallout. I think he really did come up with that name independently. I don't think he had heard our list. But if somebody asked me who came up with the name, if you had asked me until a few months ago, I would have said Brian Fargo. But whoever was in that meeting would probably go, no, that name was mine. That's why it's so hard to pinpoint who was the original source of an idea. Because there's no doubt in my mind that Brian thought of that name independently. And he was the one who explained why it was such a good name. And so he's the one responsible for the name Fallout. Even if, yes, somebody, and I don't remember who, thought of the name first. There's a lot of things like that. So let me get into the creation of the Fallout setting. And along the way, we can talk about, who had the ideas and when they actually took hold. So, according to my notes, Fallout kicked off, or what would become Fallout, in early '94 when Interplay announced, hey, we're looking for an RPG license. And that's when I was like, I want GURPS. But GURPS is just a set of mechanics. It's not a set of rules. Steve Jackson came out in early '94 to see the company, see the people. We spent the whole day. It was super fun. We went to Club 33 up in Disneyland. It was a great day. We played Illuminati. Someone corrected him on the rules. Anyway, in late that month, so this is still March of '94, I sent Steve Jackson Games a whole box of Interplay titles. So I said, okay, you've met us. You've seen the company. Here's a lot of games we've made. All I remember, because I don't actually have, I don't have signed contracts. Somewhere between then and June is when we got signed on. The only people assigned to the project at the beginning, it was me. I had a producer, Tom. All I know is by September, Tom was no longer assigned. He had 22 different projects, or project SKUs is what they're called. And he was swamped. So at some point, Alan Pavlos, the executive producer, just told me, just handle it. Just take care of it. So with Tom off, it was just me. But I did find in June, I had forgotten about this. John M. Ford, the science fiction fantasy author who also loved role-playing games and was involved with SJ Games on some of their written materials, had sent us a proposal for a setting. Because remember, with GURPS, we just got mechanics. I don't remember much about the setting. I do not have a copy of it, but I found a single line note I wrote in June of '94 that said, Chris Taylor, along with Tom Decker and myself, had a phone call. We had a conference call with John M. Ford about his design for a non-linear time travel GURPS CRPG. This is not the dinosaur time traveling game we came up with later. It was I don't even remember. I remember it was time travel and it was quite nonlinear, not just because of it being a game, but because that's the way he wrote the story. It was disjointed, I guess, is a different way of saying it. And it wasn't near the end that you could put all those pieces together and figure out what happened. We didn't go with that. In August, I found a list of people I wanted on the team, and it mentioned that I wanted Jason Taylor. So that was end of August. And then the next note I have has in September actually has him on the team. So sometime between end of August and September is when Jason Taylor and also Jason Anderson got assigned to the team. And those are the only people assigned for the rest of 94. So all the rest of the stuff I'm going to talk about where we got into setting were people who were coming up with these ideas and doing the work on their own personal time outside of interplay hours. In fact, I found at one point the art director of the company, Todd Kamasta, asked me for an art list. And my list is still generic fantasy. It says crossbows, swords, medieval armors, and then generic environments like forests and grasslands and deserts. I mean, we had not thought about this game whose engine was coming together. The sprite engine was coming together. We had not thought of a setting yet. So later, this would be after early September, but still in the fall. So it would be September or October. That's when I sent out that email saying, hey, if anybody wants to think about settings, show up at a meeting. Now, here's where things got weird. I only remember 2 meetings, but my notes clearly say after 4 or 5 meetings, we had settled on. So we obviously had more of these. I did have a note saying, I expected over a dozen people to show up, but there was only half that for the 4 or 5 meetings. So I was shocked that, like, why aren't people banging down this conference room door wanting to make a new IP? And it was because it was after hours and we were going to get paid for this. The first meeting we had, we basically just threw out ideas. And I said, anybody can throw out any idea. We're not going to critique it, but we will talk about the pros and cons of it as a setting for a computer game. And for things like that, what we talked about is how easy would it be to tell stories in it and to make quests for it? Is it evocative? Are there mysteries out there for the player to solve? Are there things for the player to do? But we weren't going to talk about, that's a dumb idea. I didn't want anyone to do that. I just wanted to say, okay, what would we do with this? Somebody threw out an idea. We all chewed on it. Like, what kind of game would we make with it? The second meeting is when that weird dinosaur spaceship time travel idea came out. I described it briefly in the previous video and also at the GDC talk I did in 2012. That was on the second meeting. It was bizarre. It was overly complex. And that was what we chewed on it. And then most people said that's too complicated. And then we cut it back to just aliens. And at one point we were talking about a setting on future Earth that had been invaded by aliens and humans were hiding in shelters all over the world. And I think that's when I said, well, there's a ton of bunkers out there already. I knew about one in West Virginia that U.S. government officials would go to. And I said, those are already existing. We could do that. From that, we kind of realized we liked the destroyed Earth setting, but not so much the alien invasion setting. So that's when we settled on post-apocalyptic. Keep in mind, there was no discussion of wasteland. And I'll make it clear because apparently no matter how much I say things, people don't really hear what I'm saying. They hear what they think I'm saying. In a previous video, I said some people had played Wasteland on the team and some people hadn't, which led to a comment going, I can't believe Wasteland wasn't an influence. They obviously played Wasteland. Yes, some people had played Wasteland. Some people hadn't. Some people played Gamma World. Some people didn't. They were influences on the game, but we weren't actually basing things. We weren't trying to pull things directly out of that game. It's very much a hodgepodge, as you will see as I do this video. There was no hard and fast rules. There was no directing vision early on. So we went with post-apocalyptic by the end of the second meeting. And apparently we had at least 2 more after that. The idea for a vault was mine. However, the name vault came from Jason Taylor. I think I just said, hey, why don't we just go with a bunker? I liked the idea of someone coming out of a bunker, not knowing what the world was like, just like the player. The idea of making it a big vault, uh, the backstory about vault tech, all that came later. Now, this is where it gets interesting because remember, I just told you no one had been assigned to the project, and this is well before we had come up with this is what the 50s are going to be like. I found a note from December of 94, and I'm writing about Junktown. Now, Junktown was Scott Campbell's idea, but he obviously hasn't been assigned to this yet. He was at those meetings, though. So he was obviously doing a lot of work. And I just tell you right now, if you like Junktown or The Hub or Necropolis, those were all Scott Campbell's. He had all these ideas very early on. Interestingly, he came on board in early 95, and by the fall of 95, he was gone. So I'll talk about that in a later video, but he had all these great ideas that you see in the Fallout that we actually shipped. So sometime around then is when I put together a prototype map. That was not the one with the knights walking around. I tried to make a prototype map that showed, let's see, I wrote down, this is in December of 94. I put together a prototype level to test features like walking around a map, melee combat, opening containers, and taking their loot. I believe it later got put out on as a demo. I'm not sure. So this would have been just me, Jason Taylor, and Jason Anderson. At the time, Jason Anderson was making all the art. Jason Taylor he'd come on to run the scriptors we'd eventually get, and make a scripting language, but instead I think he was making the world editor that we were using to put together the maps. So we started talking more about post-apocalyptic, and that's when people came up with, hey, we should do these things that were really good in Wasteland, and excuse me, these ideas that came from Gamma World. And like I mentioned in the video on influences, books and movies and other video games and tabletop games, these were all things that got smushed in to Fallout. And you can see those influences in Fallout. You can see Rangers from Wasteland. You can see the leather jacket, which came from Mad Max, not 50s greaser games. These predate Leonard's idea about making it a 50s style game. The leather jacket was what Mad Max wore, which then led to someone wanting to put in the dog and calling it dog meat, which is what the main character in A Boy and His Dog referred to his dog as once. That wasn't his name. The name was Blood. But he called his dog dog meat. And then guns. People talked about guns. And I don't have a lot of notes on this, but I know our guns came from everywhere. There were real world guns. There were guns from movies. One of the guns came from Blade Runner. Somebody liked the gun in there and we did it. So now we're past 94 into early 95. And I know Leonard got assigned to the project somewhere around March of 95. Now, he had been coming to all those meetings, and he had been doing after-hours work as well, but he was formally assigned in 95. Sometime later that year is when he came up with that idea of a rule to filter our ideas, which means for all the stuff, meetings we'd had in 94, and for a big chunk of 95, we just threw things in that we liked. Junktown, ghouls, giant scorpions. I mean, these were things that you could see in any 1950s or later post-apocalyptic sci-fi horrors of nuclear devastation movie. But it was sometime in late 95 when Leonard had his epiphany driving about, hey, why don't we make this future what the 50s, because a lot of our ideas came from those, thought the future would be. So suddenly we had a great rule for defining our architecture, our robots, what our tech would look like, and influence the music. I mean, that's why we looked for that old style music to open up with, even though we already wanted a more ambient sound for the game itself. I mean, when people talk about there were 50s music, Fallout was not riddled with 50s music everywhere. It was pretty much used in the opening and the closing cinematics. So that's as close as I can come to recreating the origin of Fallout setting. The nice way of saying it is it was a very organic process. It was a melange, a blend. A worse way of looking at it is it was very haphazard. We just threw a bunch of stuff in, and what stuck is what we liked and we kept. Because of it, I hope how I described this, you realize this is why it's really hard for me to point at an influence. And it's hard to say who's responsible for one feature because, like, just from the name alone, you know, I'm sure there's somebody who was in those meetings who went, I was the one who thought of the name Fallout. Yeah, but I'd say Brian Fargo is responsible for the game being named Fallout. Because of that, it's hard to say, like, well, who thought of this robot or who thought of this piece of armor? Because there were a lot of armor and I think even one robot design in the game before we went with the 50s aesthetic. But those things all kind of fit. But you can see some armor like metal, that metal shoulder armor, spiked armor that you're like, I don't remember seeing that in any 50s movie. You're right. That got thought of and put in before we ever thought of that aesthetic. But it still kind of fit with the whole Fallout-y vibe. So I just want to say that the setting, ideas came from many places. They passed through many hands. They eventually got filtered through Leonard's aesthetic. But there's a whole bunch of parts and individual features of the game that resonate with us, the people who made it, and also with you, the people who played it. And that, you know, vibe is partially what we put in and partially what you brought to it. And that's as close as I can come to a definitive, here's where Fallout setting came from. That's why I like to talk to other people who worked on it. They can provide more insight. But that's as close as I can come to a timeline of the creation of Fallout setting. Hope you found that informative.